Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Trumbore with your nightly review for Wednesday, February 20th. Market was sliding at the end. Dow finished down. It's about 4:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Dow finished down about 109 points to 13,926. S&P 500 lost 1.2% to 1512. And NASDAQ lost 1.5% to 3164. Gold closed 1563, down 40 bucks. To put this in perspective, it closed the year 2011, about 14 months ago, at 1565, and it's now 1563. Oil was at 94.93, down $2. 10-year Treasury at 2.01%. Producer Price Index for January was up 0.2%, also up 0.2% on the core ex-food and energy. For the last 12 months, the PPI is up 1.4%, up 1.8% on the core. Among stocks, Boeing had been up, finished essentially unchanged as the market slid. But Boeing did report that it has a possible solution for its battery problem. Google shares were down about $13 to $7.94 after finishing above 800 for the first time yesterday. Apple saw its shares lose about $11 to $4.49. The bad news there was its Chinese contractor Foxconn said it was freezing hiring of assembly line workers. So not exactly a positive. Shares in Caterpillar finished down $1.70 after poor sales for January and on a rolling 3-month basis as well. The bull bear reading, which comes out Wednesday mornings, came in at 48.4 for the bulls, 22.1 for the bears, so we're back under the 30-point spread between the two. That's the danger sign I told you about. So it's just kind of interesting because it peaked, the ratio, 2 weeks ago at 54.7 to 21.1. And the index at the time was roughly about the same level it is now. So we'll see where it goes. It's a contrarian indicator. The market didn't take a lot of heart today from minutes from the Federal Open Market Committee. Its January meeting, which was released, the minutes were released at 2 o'clock today. And the Dow tanked after that. Investors didn't like what they saw from the standpoint of the $85 billion a month in bond purchases that could be in jeopardy sooner than later. A number of officials said that their evaluation of the cost and benefits of the policy might well lead the committee to taper or end its purchases before it judged that a substantial improvement in the outlook for the labor market had occurred. According to the minutes, several others argue that the potential cost of reducing or ending asset purchases too soon were also significant, or that asset purchases should continue until a substantial improvement in the labor market outlook had occurred. The minutes said many participants expressed concern about the potential cost and risk arising from further asset purchases. Several discussed possible complications that additional purchases could have as the Fed begins to exit the strategy. A few mentioned inflation risk and some risk to financial stability. The minutes also offered up that several participants noted that a very large portfolio of long-duration assets would, under certain circumstances, expose the Federal Reserve to significant capital losses when these holdings were unwound. Others pointed to offsetting factors, and one noted that losses would not impede the effective operation of monetary policy. Just two notes on Europe. In Greece, there was a general strike today. A protester told the Associated Press, quote, "We are faced with a societal explosion if any more pressure is put on society." Not only are Greece's 1.35 million unemployed out of a total population of 11 million, unable to make ends meet, but a growing number of those still employed are struggling to feed, heat, and clothe themselves and their families and pay the increasingly hefty taxes the government is relying on to turn the economy around. 450,000 households in the country have no one working. It's just a broken society. One unemployed mother of two told the AP, quote, "Greece is not a country of bright lights and flashy events. It's a country with people committing suicide, of those unable to feed their kids properly or who steal from the supermarket. It's happening to everybody. We are these people." The GDP is expected to fall about 4% this year after a 5-year depression. The jobless rate, of course, is 27%, heading to 30% by year end. The youth jobless rate, ages 15 to 24, is 61.7%. I've warned, this is the Balkans after all. And also in the Balkans, today, in Bulgaria, Prime Minister Borisov, who seems like a good man, resigned and dissolved parliament, even after days of protest over austerity measures. This shocked the country. He had frozen salaries and pensions rather than cutting them. But high energy cost, low living standards, and new corruption allegations, not necessarily against him, but others in his government, did him in. Borisov said the threat of protests turning violent spurred his decision. "I cannot stand looking at a bloody Eagles Bridge," he said, referring to a historic intersection in Sofia that's been the scene of bloody clashes between police and protesters. "Every drop of blood is a shame for us." I've just been waiting for this all to implode. Explode first, then implode. And maybe it's this spring. And maybe days like today in the market are beginning to sniff it out. Well, we had a little break back in the U.S. on the budget deficit front, but here we go again. The sequester and the March 1st deadline, plus the looming March 27 deadline for the continuing resolution to fund the government through September 30th. From an editorial in the Wall Street Journal today, Americans need to understand that Mr. Obama is threatening that if he doesn't get what he wants, he's ready to inflict maximum pain on everybody else. He won't force government agencies to shave spending on travel and conferences and excessive pay and staffing. He won't demand that agencies cut the lowest priority spending, as any half-competent middle manager would. It's the old ploy to stir public support for all government spending by shutting down vital services first. Voters should scoff at the idea that a $3.6 trillion government can't save one nickel of every dollar that agencies spend. The $85 billion in savings is a mere 2.3% of total spending. The agencies that the White House says can't save 5%, received an average increase in their budgets of 17% in the previous 5 years, not counting their $276 billion stimulus bonus. Mr. Obama warned that the sequester will, quote, hurt our economic growth and add hundreds of thousands of Americans to the unemployment rolls. But hasn't Mr. Obama been telling us that the economy is coming back and the stock market is up? Mr. Obama just whacked the economy with a roughly $160 billion tax increase in 2013 that he says will do no harm, but he wants us to believe that $85 billion in spending cuts will trigger a recession. The sequester shaves the equivalent of about 0.25% of GDP when offsetting it against the extra money the feds are spending on Sandy relief. The journal concludes, the sequester is far from ideal, and it would make much more sense to work with Congress to set priorities, but Mr. Obama has rejected every meaningful reform and entitlements that Republicans or his own Simpson-Bowles Commission have offered. Obamacare will add more than $1 trillion in new cost and add some 17 million people to Medicaid, but he says this can't be touched. In his State of the Union address, Mr. Obama proposed $83.4 billion in new spending, according to a tally by the National Taxpayers Union. If Mr. Obama really wants to eliminate the sequester, Republicans are ready to negotiate. But if he won't drop his tax increase and negotiate in good faith, as he hasn't during his presidency, then the sequester is the only way that any spending is going to be cut. The economy will be better for it. Due to time constraints, I'm going to cite House Speaker John Boehner's op-ed in the Journal in my Week in Review column. And yes, I need a drop of water, and it's over there, but I'm not going to reach for it. From an editorial in the Washington Post, former Senator Alan Simpson and former Clinton White House Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles administered a dose of realism to Washington on Tuesday, announcing an update to their eponymous 2010 deficit reduction plan. This new Simpson-Bowles outline seeks $2.4 trillion in 10-year savings, on top of the $2.7 trillion already achieved, thus potentially bringing the ratio of debt to gross domestic product below 70% by early next decade and putting it on a downward path thereafter. This is this is $900 billion more debt reduction than President Obama advocated in the State of the Union address. Good. Mr. Obama's goal is not ambitious enough. It would leave debt to GDP at a dangerously high 73% by 2023, with no plan to prevent it from rising after that. Simpson-Bowles 2.0 would take some steps Mr. Obama has already contemplated, such as adjusting federal tax brackets and benefits by a more realistic inflation measure, as well as some he would not, such as going above $400 billion in health program savings over 10 years. But there's almost no point debating these specifics because there's little chance of a grand bargain along Simpson-Bowles lines. Mr. Obama and his Republican opponents can't even agree on how to avoid a short-term across-the-board spending cut, the sequester. That was from the editorial in the Washington Post. Okay, on to this topic. Editorial Wall Street Journal, the world has never seen a state devote such large resources to siphoning off data from private companies to advance a broad range of national interest, political and economic. China's penchant for online theft and sabotage could change the world economic order. If that seems an overstatement, consider that the Industrial Revolution and successive waves of innovation have depended on a legal and cultural framework that allows entrepreneurs to profit from their ingenuity and hard work. In China and other authoritarian regimes, by contrast, tycoons typically rise and maintain their position through political clout or corruption. They've always been free riders on the free market's creative power. Until now, China did a little damage to innovators and even helped them, for instance, by supplying the labor to build Steve Jobs' gadgets. But Beijing now seems intent on abusing the world's economic rules to such an extent that it threatens the prosperity of everyone else. No wonder former Google CEO Eric Schmidt writes in a forthcoming book that China's hacking and control over information makes it dangerous. Okay. The Soviet Union threatened the capitalist West using overt military might and political subversion. The danger from Chinese hacking is more insidious because Beijing purports to play by the rules while subverting them with tools that are hard to track and stop. Beijing has calculated that in order for Chinese companies to continue to grow at breakneck speed, they need to cheat. The effect could be to drag the West back to a world in which companies and states must work hand in glove instead of at arm's length. Beijing has long wanted to showcase the triumph of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And in a way it has. Its defining characteristic is theft. It's the Wall Street Journal. From Lolita Baldor of the Associated Press, she quotes former FBI Executive Assistant Director Sean Henry. If the Chinese government flew planes into our airspace, our planes would escort them away. If it happened 2, 3, or 4 times, the president would be on the phone and there would be threats of retaliation. This is happening thousands of times a day. There needs to be some definition of where the red line is and what the repercussions would be. James Lewis, a cybersecurity expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said that in the past year the White House has been taking a serious look at responding to China. I agree with that. Adding that this will be the year they will put more pressure on, even while realizing it will be hard for the Chinese to change. There's not an on-off switch. From an editorial in Global Times, which is a Chinese mouthpiece, Chinese government mouthpiece, they quote a fellow from the Institute of the Communication University of China. He says, the U.S. media has been sensationalizing the so-called Chinese cyber attack to increase the world's unnecessary wariness against China, and it would also give its military forces excuses to invest more in its own cyber espionage technology. But, curiously, Global Times does quote extensively from Mandiant's report. If you were looking for a positive, I found that quite positive. They quote from the report lines such as, "It is one of the most prolific cyber espionage groups in terms of the sheer quantity of information stolen," referring to Unit 61398. So that was interesting. Well, that's all for today. I apologize about my voice. I'll do a better job tomorrow, Thursday. One last item. Former Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. pleaded guilty to charges that could send him to prison for roughly 4 years. His wife is also in trouble. She could go to prison. And that's our dirtball couple of the year. Have a good night. Take care.